Check, check, check. There we go. Okay, now you should be hearing me. Hey, hey, hey. Yep, I got signal. Great. Okay, cool. Okay, so we're going to look at the mix window here. And I need to quickly put these all into my main left and right output. Okay, so now I have all of these things here, and let's just look at the vocal. So we're going to only pay attention to these last two things here. I'm actually going to delete these because I'm just going to start from scratch. So let's say we're in Pro Tools, and I want to add a reverb to my send. Okay, that's probably the most common thing we're going to do in this class off the bat. So we're going to look at our sends, and I'm going to open this send, and in this output, I'm not going to choose a physical output. I'm going to choose a bus output. So a bus output in Pro Tools, this is what's kind of confusing, is that it's not what we typically call a bus. If you see the word bus in Pro Tools, think of it as patch cable. Translate that as patch cable. Okay? So I'm going to go out bus 1 and 2. And basically I've just made a patch cable that says I want my signal to go somewhere else. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to turn that level all the way up, and it's going to bus 1 and 2. Well, bus 1 and 2 doesn't have a destination. So I'm going to create a new stereo auxiliary inputs. I'm going to call this reverb. Okay, and then it created this here, and it says reverb down here. So if your resolution, I'll try to talk my way through all of this if your resolution isn't good enough to read this stuff. So the purple, the violet color here is my vocal, and this is my reverb. I'm going to actually mute everything except for these, just so we don't listen to other stuff. And I'm going to play back a little bit of my audio. Okay, so there we go. We got a female vocalist, and I want to send some reverb to some reverb. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a reverb plugin into this channel. Deverb.
How did you do that? How did you just mute everything? Oh.
If you hold the Option key and you click on mute, it will mute everything at once. Yeah, that's one of the shortcuts I'm going to talk about here in a minute. So yeah, I'll show you some of these tricks. We're going to put the deverb in here, and the deverb is the one that comes with Pro Tools, and we're just going to leave it on the default just for giggles. And I need to change the input, which is this top line, this top guy here, and the input here is going to be a bus input, because remember, bus is like a patch cable, and I've already sent the patch cable from the vocal. Now I just need to have it go somewhere. So the input of this is going to be bus 1 and 2. So this is feeding into this. But it's actually feeding into the top of this so that the signal can flow through. So now when I hit play, you will have reverb with the singer.
Come and go with me into a place where we...
Right? Okay, so what's happening here is that we have made an auxiliary send. Now, the process is called making an auxiliary send, even though the terminology is a little jacked in Pro Tools. We'll address that in a minute here. So we have done what is called, right now, it is what is called a post-fader send. What you're going to notice is that, in a second, I'm going to turn down the vocalist as we... And as the vocalist comes down, the reverb is going to go with her.
And all be free. Come and go with...
Right? So I turn it down, she disappears, the reverb disappears. That is because this is what's called a post-fader send. And when it's post-fader, it means that the output of that auxiliary send is dependent on the fader. If the fader turns down, the send turns down. Now, this other fader is relative to this one. It's not going to go down with it. This is not the same fader in two different places. These are different faders. But if I turn this off here, nothing's going here, which is why it disappears. It's kind of like, imagine plumbing. If you have a dial in a pipe halfway through the pipe, and you turn, or actually, if you've ever been under the sink in your bathroom, there's a knob down there. If you turn that knob off, it doesn't matter how much you turn the water on in the sink, it's not turning on, right? Because you've cut the water off earlier. So a post fader send is like that. This guy controls how much is sent here. This is relative to this. So again, when I turned this down, the reverb went with it. It's a post fader send because the sound of the reverb is dependent on and subservience to this main fader. Okay? I'm going to wait for this to catch up so I can make sure that everybody makes this all makes sense to everybody so far, because I know I'm going to throw you a loop here in a second. So if I can just get a couple, send me a question or whatever. Oh, I guess I'm just realizing I don't have to wait for the stream. I think you're going to hear me talking twice here in a second. Anybody have any questions so far? We all good so far? Okay, cool. So the other type of plugin that you're going to get, and you're probably going to use it mostly in live sound. Nope, let's. Okay, so I've made this a pre-fader send, which means that when I hit play, the signal comes straight from here and then goes here. Okay? So watch what happens now. I am pre-fader. Watch what happens now when I play it back.
Hi, hi, come and go with me into a place where we can all be free. Come and go with me.
So as you can see, it doesn't matter what this does. The reverb never changes.
To a place where we can fly high. Come and go with me into a place.
It's pre-fader, which means that this fader is completely independent of this fader. Now, usually you do not want to do this. It's not usually something that you want to happen. Okay, there we go. You guys should hear me from there. Cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple things. So you've got your main path. You've got a microphone that comes in here, and then it goes through the EQ, like we talked about. It would go through an insert if there was one. It would go through your fader. It would go through your pan knobs, and then it would go to your main left and right. Okay? Now an auxiliary send, this is our fader here, so a pre-fader auxiliary send would come from here. A post-fader auxiliary send would come from here. Okay? Let me zoom in and make sure everybody can see that and make sure that that makes sense to everybody. Come on, there we go. There we go. So, again, microphone, EQ, pre-fader send, fader, because it's pre, right? Post-fader send, because there's your fader. Panning knob, left and right. Okay? So that's all your basics there for your auxiliary sends. Now, we refer to those as an auxiliary send because it's an auxiliary type of mix. It's a second type of mix that we're going to use for something. And it's usually going to be, pre-fader is usually going to be for monitors, and post-fader is usually going to be for FX. So that's your number one way to think of that. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this a little bit. I'm going to simplify this drawing a little bit. Where's the bottom here? Okay, here we go. And let's say that I have 3 inputs here, 3 microphones coming down this way, and they're going through all that rigmarole I just talked about, okay? Now, let's say that I have, actually, you know what? I think I have a better way to show you this. Let's do this. Let's actually show it to you on the console. That makes more sense, because it's right here. Yes, this is perfect. Okay, so here's how this works. Okay, so in here, let's say I've got these 3 channels. Okay, so I've got these 3 channels that are going to be for my whatever my instruments are. These shouldn't be up. Okay, so these are going to be here. Let's say I've also got a ton of things happening down on the other end. Well, you can't see those faders. Let's say that I had more than 3. Let's say I had 10 faders up. Let's say there's other ones coming down this direction. It's not uncommon for me to have, let's say, a drum set that takes up... Oops, I'm blowing you guys away. Sorry, let me back off on my voice here. Okay, so... it's not uncommon for me to have a drum set that has 10 plus microphones involved in it, so all sorts of stuff connected this way. Now, unfortunately, the issue here is that, whoops. The issue here is that I can't move all of these at the same time relative to each other smoothly, right? There's no way that's going to happen. So I have a couple different ways that I can control multiple different channels. So the first one is what's called a group. So what I'm going to do is instead of sending all of these to the main left and right, I'm actually going to turn them off to the main left and right, and I'll show you how you do this in Pro Tools in a second. And instead, I'm going to send them to a group, and I'm going to send them to my groups 7 and 8. And in that way, these are the outputs for that group. So what I've done is I've taken all of these guys and I've sent them to these 2 faders. So basically I made submasters is a term that used to be used. It's not super popular anymore, but it would be a submaster. So these groups now contain all of these faders, and I don't have to move these. If I want to move the entire drum set as one piece, I can just move these 2 faders. Instead of having to move 10, I can move 2. Makes life a lot easier. The other thing I can do with this group is that I have the ability to EQ it. I actually have another EQ right here in addition to the one on the channel. And I can also put a compressor here. So I can compress my entire drum kit and not just one piece at a time. So a group allows me to do all of that stuff. Now, there is another term for this, and that's a bus. And here's what's so weird. All a bus is the exact same thing, except I don't have the option to use any processing like an EQ or compressor. All a bus is a set of sub-master faders without any ability to process. A group is the same thing, except I do have the option to process it. Now, in the analog realm, that was a thing because I would physically have to have the wiring to be allowed to do that on a group. Digitally, it doesn't matter, right? There's really no difference because I can just not put a process on a digital input and it's a bus. So it didn't really matter. The terminology falls apart in digital, but it makes sense in analog. Now, there's one more thing I want to show you, and then I'm going to switch over to Pro Tools so I can show you that, is that you can also do what's called a VCA. On this console, these white faders are VCAs. Now, VCAs, they're also called DCAs, D as in dog. They're also called DCAs on a console when they're digitally controlled. So DCA is a digitally controlled amplifier. A VCA is a voltage-controlled amplifier. So obviously that's an analog thing. They're the same thing. The same concept is applied to a VCA or DCA, depending on what hardware or software you're using. All of these guys here can be controlled with one master fader. Except the difference is that this is a remote control. A VCA allows me to control all of these, but no sound travels through this fader. It is literally a remote control. Okay?
I mean, Danielle, it's just
Oh. Eddie,
yeah,
sorry. Eddie, your mic's on. I can hear you. So, so there's no audio actually going through this.
it's probably not. The shoot definitely don't help.
There we go. So everybody, so nothing's actually going through this. It's just a remote control. It's telling these faders to turn themselves up and down, and it gives me the control to do that. So a VCA, a group, and a bus are all the same purpose. They allow you to take multiple channels and control them with one or two faders. But the differences is that a group allows you to put processing on that set, but the sound still goes through the faders. A bus allows you to just control those things with faders, and the sound is going through the faders. And a VCA allows you to remote control the original faders. Okay? So my stream should be catching up here in a sec. Okay, with the stream caught up, did I confuse the hell out of anybody at that point? Are we good so far? Does that make sense? Everybody good? Anybody? Any replies here? Okay, I just don't see any videos moving, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't frozen. Okay, now let me switch over to Pro Tools so I can show you how all of this translates into Pro Tools. Okay, so here's where it's unfortunately a little confusing. So, being that Pro Tools is digital, oops, sorry, I'm echoing. There we go. Being that Pro Tools is digital, whether or not something is a remote control or a group or a bus doesn't make any difference, right? It's all digital. There's no downside. The reason that we actually made VCAs is because in the analog realm, whenever you have in the analog realm, whenever you have circuit sound going through circuits, you're degrading the sound slightly. So the idea is that if I'm working on a console like this, if I'm working on this giant console, I want to minimize how many electronic circuits are in the path because it will degrade my sound. So the idea of the VCA was that the VCA would be a remote control and it would eliminate another circuit from the path, which would clean up the sound. Now, as we're talking about digital, that doesn't make a damn bit of sense, right? It's digital. There's no impact on putting another fader in the line. It has zero impact on that. So what we're going to do instead, so this is no, well, actually, let's leave that reverb where it is. I'm going to create a new track. Now, here's the thing. I'm going to create a new track, but what kind of track am I going to create? I'm going to create an auxiliary inputs, but I'm creating a group. Okay? But they call the channel you return everything into an aux, even though that's not what it is. I'm making a group. Okay, so this is a group. I'm going to change the color so that it makes it obvious to us all. I'm going to make it ugly bright green. And here's what I'm going to do. Let's say I want to take the sax and the flute, which are these two yellow guys right here, and the keyboards. Let's say I want to take all that, I want to put it in a group. I'm going to come to the outputs of this, and I'm going to choose bus 3 and 4. Whoops, chose the wrong one. But remember, in this situation, a bus is just a patch cable. So now I have these going to bus 3 and 4. Now I'm going to mute that, and I'm going to unmute these 4. I'm going to play a little bit of that. Now, obviously, just that one keyboard is playing, and there's some buzz in it. But you'll notice that I turned down the group. It turned down everything that was in that group. But I made a group because if I wanted to process all of it, I can come up here, and I can say that I want a compressor on that entire group. Okay? And now I'm going to compress all 4 of these channels that are coming through this fader. So by definition, I have made a group. But how did I make that group? I created an auxiliary return, and I used a bus to get there. The terminology is jacked up because the terminology falls apart in digital. So think of the bus as a patch cable, and the auxiliary returns in Pro Tools as just an incoming channel as a destination. Because really, if I take away this compressor, it's a bus, right? The definition of a bus is you put everything together, but you don't process it. I'm not processing it, so technically, this is a bus in the truest sense of the word, right? As soon as I put a plug-in on it, it's a group in the truest sense of a word. But at the same time, if you really wanted to argue the difference, it's a VCA too, because it's just remote controlling everything that's going on. There's no impact to the sound. So the point here, and I don't want to confuse everybody with the terminology, the point here is that it's not about what you call it. It's about understanding the purpose for doing it. So really a bus and a group is interchangeable. It's really the same thing. You can, and this makes it even a little bit more confusing, and I don't understand why they did this, but they did. Guess what else they added? You can add a VCA to Pro Tools now. There's no, you can't see it because I got my screen there, but you can't put plugins on a VCA. But what can you do? You create a group, and then you create a group, which is another terminology that's messed up, and you can send all these things to your VCA, and then the VCA can control all of that. So, unfortunately, the terminology is confusing. This is not a Pro Tools only thing, so don't hurt on Pro Tools for it, because Logic and everybody else does the exact same thing. The problem is that we had all these terms and all of these processes that came about because of things that had to happen in the analog realm, and then we switched it over to digital, and that fell apart, but we still had to use those terms. So why does it call it a bus in Pro Tools when it's actually the same? A bus is the same thing you would use to make an auxiliary send, and a bus is the same thing that you would use to make a group in the truest sense. Because in the very earliest days of Pro Tools, It wasn't even called Pro Tools then. It was called Sound Tools. You couldn't do all this extra stuff. So they said, okay, let's give you the option to make a bus. Let's give you the option to take 2 or 3 things and put them together in a bus so you can control them with one fader. And that was great when that was the only feature that the computers of the day could handle. But as computers got better, they said, well, we want to be able to make aux sends. We want to be able to make groups. We want to be able to do this other stuff. That's great. There was no reason for them to come up with another term because this patch cable idea of a bus was fine. So it's kind of a grandfathered thing. We just kind of have to get used to it. It's the way it is. Again, it's not just Pro Tools. Logic does the same thing. Harrison Mixbus does the same thing. GarageBand does the same thing. Ableton does the same thing. They all do it. So the idea is to think about what it is you're trying to do, and then think of how Pro Tools makes that happen. Okay? So ultimately, going through these terms is not meant to confuse you. The ultimate idea is to think of, why would I want to do this? And here's why you'd want to do this. I want to make a group when I think that my drums sound good, but I'd like to just deal with all of them at once. Okay? I would make a bus when all I want to do is control my drums. But I kind of don't want to be able to put a plugin in there because, and this is, there's no technical reason, but I don't want to give myself the temptation to process the entire drum set. So maybe I want to use maybe I just want to not put plugins in it. Now I'm going to set it up, a group and a bus are going to set up the exact same way. I just want to be like, you know what? I don't want to process it. So technically I'm creating a bus in the analog sense. Okay? What you call it is not relevant. What you're thinking about is the point. Don't put a plug in here just because you think you have to. In a VCA, I can say, well, a VCA, I just want to control it. I don't want to process it. Maybe I use a VCA. And VCAs work a little differently in Pro Tools, but we will get to that. Okay? The bottom line of all of this is that these allow you to control more than one channel at a time. That's the really, truly important part, is that I need to control more than one channel at a time. It's not uncommon. Most of the sessions I give you this semester are going to be fairly small, maybe a dozen tracks at most. But I have sessions that get up into the 60s and 70s for channel counts. And I have one, I think I've mentioned it before, I had one thing where every member of a community concert band sent me their own tracks individually, and I ended up with 120 channels in my Pro Tools session. So obviously I can't controlling those with a mouse is a nightmare. Even controlling those with a control surface is not useful. So what I ended up doing with that band was that I took all the saxophones and put them in a group. And I took all the tubas and I put them in a group. And I took all the flutes and put them in a group. And suddenly my 120-piece orchestra, my concert band, ended up being like 8 or 10 faders total. It was much more reasonable. So you just want to get used to this in terms of organizing things. So the idea of making a group, a bus, or VCA is about organization. It's about making life easier for you. The idea of an auxiliary send is for something else. An auxiliary send allows you to make reverbs, or it allows you to give somebody, if you want to think about it, an auxiliary send is for someone else. I want to put a reverb on you to make you sound good. So I am creating an auxiliary send so that I can do something for someone else. I need to make a monitor send or headphone send for me to do this recording. I'm going to use an auxiliary send to make those headphones for someone else, right? And a group and a bus and a VCA have no impact on the sound. They're just a way to organize your session to make it good for you. Okay? So I think, hopefully that'll help. So I'll wait for your questions here in a second. Okay, so we're looking at deverb here. This is the reverb that I put into the into the session when we're listening to that. And there's a couple things that we want to pay attention to on this. Every reverb. Sorry, I could hear myself in the stream. I need to turn that off. Okay, so there's a couple different things that most reverbs are going to have similar settings on them. One of the things about reverbs, though, is that I mentioned on for an EQ, every EQ is going to have gain, frequency, and Q. Most compressors are going to have ratio and threshold, and then maybe attack and release, and maybe knee. Reverbs are all over the map. They might be one knob. They might give you some of these things and not others. So we're going to give you kind of the general overview, but don't be surprised if you see other knobs and things on a reverb. So the first thing we want to talk about here is all of this stuff down here. Decay is probably the most obvious setting that you're going to have. Decay is how long the reverb actually lasts. Whoops, I need to make her, let's mute that.
Go with me into a place where we can all be free. Come and go with me and come on.
Right, so we can go totally crazy and do an infinite reverb if we really want to, although in practice that's not super useful. But we want, the decay will obviously tell me how long the reverb is going to last. Pre-delay is how long do we wait until the reverb actually starts. Now, when you have an actual reverb in the world, what ends up happening there is that your sound has to travel and bounce off of the first wall in the room before it can start bouncing around the room, right? The pre-delay says, how long does it take for your voice or your sound to hit that first wall? Okay? So 1 millisecond is roughly a foot. So 18 milliseconds is roughly 18 feet away from the wall. And it will, from a sonic standpoint, what it does is it actually, I need to get back to a point where you're going to have something to hear. From a sonic standpoint, what it does is it separates your voice
Flying high in the sky.
From the actual reverb.
Flying high in the sky.
You can hear that there's like a little...
Flying high in the sky.
Right? You can hear there's almost like a little echo to that.
Flying high in the sky.
Because it's taking a while before it actually starts. So pre-delay can put some space between your vocal and the delay, and the reverb, and it gives it even kind of a bigger sense of space because it takes a while before it hits that first wall. Now, you're going to see diffusion, high frequency cut, low pass filter, high pass filter, all sorts of stuff. The best way I like to think about these kind of settings is this is how you redecorate the room, okay? Changing these settings would be the equivalent of adding curtains to an empty room, or putting a thick carpet on the floor, or, of course, putting acoustical treatments on the wall. So that's what this does.
I don't know just how high I'll go, it seems. My dreams are so very,
And this is probably one of the most subtle settings you're going to have in a reverb.
very, very far away. But you can come with me. Yeah. Don't you want
See, now the reverb that's left is kind of dark because I've cut all the high frequencies out of it, as if I have thick curtains on the wall.
to be flying high in the sky? Flying high in the sky.
Right? And now it's really bright because I turned off the high frequency cut and it's letting all the high frequencies go through. So that's what you're going to have with that. The last thing that's here on the bottom is what's called the mix control. Whenever you're doing this, just leave it 100% wet. That just means that sound comes into this plugin and what comes out is nothing but the reverb. It's not the original sound. So that's what that's for. Okay? Leave that 100% wet because remember, we're using a post-fader send over here, right? The P, if it's lit, that means it's pre-fader. That means it's post-fader if it's not lit. So Our vocal is being sent to our bus 1 and 2, which is our reverb, which is this one right here, and it's turned up, okay? So I want the purple channel to provide my vocal, and I want the green channel to provide my reverb, which is where this deverb is connected. Hope I'm not making anybody sick. Sorry, it's moving so quick. Okay, small, medium, and large is how big relatively these rooms are. That's pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to really talk much about that. But let's talk about these different types of reverbs. Now, different types of places are going to sound different because of their construction. Now, the first one here is hall. When this says hall, I'm not talking about a hallway. I'm talking about a concert hall. So if you see the term hall, it's a concert hall. It's not just a hallway. Okay? And that's what we have been listening to up until now.
Flying high in the sky.
Okay, so there's my hall. Now, a church does not mean the vineyard. Church is talking about cathedrals. We're talking about Notre Dame. We're talking about, all the stuff in Italy and Europe. We're talking giant stone cathedral.
Flying high in the sky.
Right? Much thicker sounding, much bigger sounding, much more churchy sounding. We're going to skip plate for a minute because that's a separate thing. Room is talking about a decent sized room. And we're talking about, this could be a room to the size of, anywhere from the size of the recording studio to the size of, the band room in Battelle. Okay?
Ooh, freedom from the cares of this life.
Right? Another smaller thing. We're not really, another smaller thing going on there. Not as big as the church or the hall, just a little bit smaller. Room is just a variation on that because rooms can be different. Now you're going to see this one called ambient, and you're going to also see it, honestly, I think the more common term is chamber. Now a chamber is like, you're talking about like a closet, like a very small closet. So it's just a very small sense of space. It's not very big, but it does add something.
Gives me the strength it takes to make me fly.
So I'm going to bypass this on and off so you can really hear the difference.
High hopes I have, not afraid to try. You can come with me.
Actually, I need to do this.
Don't you want to be?
See, that's without. Very dry. So an ambient or a chamber reverb allows you to have a really small space, and what it really ends up doing in a mix is, this is where it gives you that depth, where it says, it's just a little bit, there's just something behind it there, there's just depth. It's not, the person's not totally in my face, it's not totally blowing me away. Okay? So that's what the ambient is for. Now, the plate is the one that is weird, because the plate is not something that happens in nature. The plate is a totally artificial reverb. Now, let me pull up, I'm going to pull up a different plug-in, because a plate, I've got this other reverb has a good graphic of it. So it's not gonna help me if you can't see it. Got to move my fat head. There we go. Okay. Okay, this is the Abbey Road plates. I don't think we have those at school, but we still have plate reverbs. So the plates, and it's not just Abbey Road. The plates are a big thing all over the place. Plates are an actual piece of metal suspended in a box. Okay? And what happens is, I don't know if any of you were in concert band in high school, there's something called a thunder sheet, where you get a big sheet of metal and you shake it and it rumbles and it kind of does that kind of thing. It's the same concept, except this, obviously this is a graphic, not a picture, but this is actually a small speaker that is glued to or bolted to the plate, and it vibrates the plate when you send sound through it. These guys over here represent the pickups, like the stick-on pickup transducers. So you send sound through this, and you get a very interesting sound. All I'm getting is heavy breathing. Let's...
Come on,
There we go. So it gives you a sense of space, just like the other reverbs do. But the interesting thing is when you listen to it, it doesn't insinuate that you are in any specific space, right? It doesn't sound like a hall. It doesn't sound like a room. It just sounds like space. So plates are really useful when you don't want to commit yourself to making it sound like you're actually in a specific place. Okay? It's really useful when you just want that sense of space, but you don't want people to be like, oh, I can tell we're in a concert hall. Oh, we're in a church. I don't want that to happen. I just want you to have a sense of space. I just want you to feel that you're somewhere. I don't want you necessarily think that you're somewhere specific. I just want you to feel like you are in a space. So plates are great for just giving a general sense of space that does not tie you to anything specific. And there is a plate here. I just used the Abbey Road one because I wanted to show you the graphic. Right? So when you're playing with stuff, give that thing a shot. I love plates. I use plates all the time. They sound great. You get a lot of mileage. So like in compression, I said you get a lot of mileage out of threshold and ratio. In reverb, you get a ton of mileage out of the type, the decay, and the pre-delay. Like this other stuff is subtle, real subtle. Well, I guess the size of the room would make a difference too. But the length of it's obvious. But man, this pre-delay can really, really help you out. If it feels like your reverb is just super thick and getting in the way of everything, a little bit of pre-delay pushes it away and makes some space, and it's so much cooler. It leaves you so much more space. So it's really useful for doing that. Okay?